Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mad in America. I'm Leah Harris, your host for today, and I'm thrilled to bring you this conversation with our guest, Sasha Durakov Warren. Sasha is the author of the new book, Storming Bedlam, Madness, Utopia and Revolt, published by Common Notions Press. Sasha's a writer based in Minneapolis. His experiences within the psychiatric system and a commitment to radical politics led him to co-found the group Hearing Voices Twin Cities, which provides an alternative social space for individuals to discuss often stigmatized, extreme experiences and network with one another. Following the George Floyd uprising in 2020, he founded the project of Unsound Mind to trace the histories of psychiatry, social work, and public health's connections to policing, prisons, and various disciplinary and managerial technologies. Welcome, Sasha. It is so great to have you here with us today. First of all, I want to congratulate and thank you for this outstanding new critical history of psychiatry that you've written here. And I was wondering if you could maybe start off by telling our listeners a little bit more about yourself, as well as the genesis of this book.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be here. As far as the genesis of the book goes, psychiatry is a field that I've had personal relationship to for pretty much my whole life, either personally or in my family. But it was also something that I just kind of took for granted for a long time and didn't really think too much about. Certainly didn't think of it as like a field that had some sort of direct relationship with politics or economics or anything like that. I knew that it did, but I just kind of took it for granted for a long time. But I was always interested in like radical politics since a very young age. I was reading like anarchist politics and didn't discover people like Marx until later, but was reading a lot of like especially anarchists and radicals of that milieu in my youth. And at some point, I just read some critiques, some articles by people in the field of like disability studies and critical neurodivergence and stuff that connected some dots for me, maybe connected some of these political, economic critiques that I'd been thinking about and taking very seriously for a long time. And the fields that maybe regulate what we would call the difference between normal and abnormal. That was really my entry point, is thinking about that in a philosophical or theoretical way of like what actually is normal and what is abnormal. It's a big question. And the fact that it had never really occurred to me to think of it so directly, it made my mind kind of explode. I really just like got deeply, deeply invested in thinking about this. The more I thought about it, the less clear the distinction became to me. And then I couldn't help but wonder about all these different services that I experienced or seen, and these institutions or fields that rely on this distinction. What's their purpose, and how do they make that distinction on an institutional level? And these were really the questions that animated me when I first got into it. I still don't have the answers to any of these questions necessarily, but they kind of took me down that path. And then as far as the book itself is concerned, after the George Floyd uprising in 2020, I was inspired to do something that collected all this thinking and research that I've been doing for a long time together in a coherent project. So I had this idea of doing about a 6-month-long Zoom series that would be about the intertwining histories of radical politics, and the field of psychiatry, and also just not necessarily like radical politics in terms of people who see themselves as engaged in radical politics, but also just massive monumental historical events, like the transition to democracy or the American Revolution or the Industrial Revolution, and how these monumental social changes affected the field of psychiatry and the way it thinks itself and practices. And that series became the basis of the book. So it was kind of the bones. It was the material that I ended up using even though at the time I didn't necessarily have a coherent, all-encompassing theory that covered all that material, it gave me the impetus and the inspiration, and also just like the raw material that I ended up using.
So, Sasha, I'd love to back up a bit and talk about some of the archival research that you did to prepare for this book, in places like Minnesota, Massachusetts, and elsewhere. Tell us a little bit about that project, and especially any of the more memorable moments or surprises or discoveries that you had diving into the archives.
The fascination with diving into the archive started a ways back. I think like a lot of people who get interested in the field of psychiatry, become fascinated with the sites of asylums. They dot the landscape. They're these massive, overbearing, heavy symbolic places. Everybody knows that an enormous amount of people were there, that an enormous amount of suffering happened there, but there's a kind of wall between us and that experience that makes it hard to engage with it in a serious way. I discovered at a certain point, through just doing like independent research and wanting to find the resources to be able to learn more about that experience, that the historical societies hold a lot of these records, and that they're available to the public, that you don't need to have any kind of special training or experience to have access to these. So honestly, I just started going and asking for stuff and communicating with the archivist, kind of telling them what I was interested in, and just flipping through materials. And as you kind of go through it, you do learn a little bit about how to effectively filter through, because you're looking at like thousands and thousands of pages of oftentimes very boring administrative details. But you learn how to like filter through those things, and you also learn how to get a box, look through it, and then kind of figure out what the next thing to look for might be. Like you follow the trails where they lead you, basically. And eventually I discovered through doing this process a massive wealth of material, of institutional publications. So many, many institutions in the United States, it seems like perhaps most of them, of these long-term psychiatric institutions that we generally call asylums, had their own regular publication. Oftentimes it was a weekly, a monthly. Just so many had them, and I had no idea that these existed. So I discovered early on like that you really have to pay a lot of attention to the editorial details and the organizational details behind them, because oftentimes the like head editors would be somebody like the superintendent or the head nurse. Other times it would be run by the patients themselves, and you could really tell the difference in tenor between these different publications. You can kind of tell that there's maybe a reticence about being completely upfront, and completely honest about everything that's happening in the various like poetry and write-ups and things like that. So you have to have some like read between the lines and the ability to understand the conditions of production under which these were made. But even that sparks like a ton of new questions and thoughts about like, what was this institution like? Especially when you have like foreknowledge that the institution was particularly bad, and then the writing is all like very exuberant and happy. You have to wonder like, okay, what's happening here? Is this like a special unit that's maybe like an outpatient unit that's very different from the day to day, or is something happening on the editorial level? But these questions of power came to the fore and were really interesting. But even more than that, what I discovered in these works, and has become like the basis of all the writing that I do on psychiatry, is like a social basis, and a basis in the everyday life of people who are, diagnosed and treated in psychiatry. I try to base everything I do off of having some kind of understanding of these types of social dynamics. And like what I'm bringing up with the editors and all this stuff is that you can't just take them directly at face value. I don't think you can take really like any social relationship directly at face value, because all of our social relationships are mediated through like power dynamics, through institutional conditions, through the conditions of life itself and our limitations as a species. So these documents are like a perfect object study for that type of mediated social study. Then the other surprise came from, like you mentioned, I kind of ventured out of Minnesota when I was writing the book. I visited some archives in Massachusetts and Amherst, where they have a large collection of works from the American, what is called the anti-psychiatry movement, Judy Chamberlain, the Mental Patients Liberation Front, and other groups. They have a massive collection of these kinds of things. I spent a couple of days there, just flipping through these old journals. I also went to New York and went to Weill Cornell's psychiatric archive, and I had a great experience there because I went there hoping to read volumes of the Opal, which was a very central part of the book, discovering this journal, the Opal, from the Utica Lunatic Asylum in New York from the 18, I think it was like the 1840s to the 1870s, maybe. But that is an incredible resource of some of the most fascinating writing from psychiatric patients in an institution, particularly because it seemed like there were mentioning those editorial standards, it seemed like there were very few editorial constraints. The patients would just openly talk about the conditions of the asylum. There was like kind of jokey articles about like organizing a revolution. It has a very like silly, but also very direct tone. But what was even more surprising is the absolute exuberance of the patients for this system of moral treatment. That was definitely shocking. I did not expect that of people who were living in an asylum with a very, very rosy view of the form of treatment being offered, even while being very direct about certain conditions or institutional problems. That was a major discovery that I had to grapple with and think, because when you go into the archive, what you're trying to discover is reality as it was, not as you like expect it to be, and that's part of the joy, is like confronting things that force you to think about something in a different way, or to force you to ask questions that you never would have asked. So visiting archives is fun, and it it forces you to ask a lot of interesting questions, and sometimes you meet somebody who like changes the direction of your entire research program.
I love these stories and also share your love of the archives as well. You do an incredible job of myth busting in these pages. And I wonder if you could talk some about some of the founding myths of psychiatry that you interrogate in the book and what you see as the purpose that they serve. In particular, you write about the mythos surrounding Philippe Pinel, who was an 18th century physician, who you write about has achieved this sort of mythic status in modern psychiatric history for, quote, liberating patients from the asylum. What have we gotten wrong about his story, and why does this matter?
It's kind of how I opened the book, talking about Pinel and this repetition of certain myths throughout the history of psychiatry. The Pinel myth, in brief, is that he was this like unsuccessful family doctor who got his first major position in the Salpêtrière, which was the major women's asylum in Paris. And he's like so aghast at the institutional conditions he enters, and he like sees it's like this dungeon, people are kept in chains, and he's just like horrified at this really deep moral level, and he has this strong reaction, and he at a certain point breaks the chains, unlocks the patients from their shackles, and institutes this system called moral treatment that includes reforms at virtually every level of the way that mad people were treated in the late 18th century, and is oftentimes generally considered like the birth of psychiatry or modern psychiatry, the transition to like a fully new system and a revolution inaugurating a new period. And that includes things like treating the mad person as a human being. Oftentimes in the 18th century, people talked about the mad as if they were animals, and they completely lost reason. And, you know, what moral treatment says is, instead of having your reason be destroyed, madness actually is a damaged form of reason, which therefore means can be reformed and brought back and like rehabilitate these people that have been considered completely alien to the human community, the human species. It involved like institutional reforms. So centralizing space in the asylums. The madhouse system existed before, so that was not necessarily like a major shift as having a centralized space, but rationalizing the space. So like we're not just taking any old like problem person off the streets. We're treating a very specific group of people, mad people, and we're going to develop specific methods for them that are specific to their ailments and problems. So these are kind of the basic elements of moral treatment. There's more. It is a very totalizing system, but those are kind of the basic components. And then the kind of the myth goes that after he inaugurated this new system based on principles of personal emancipation and the capacity to be healed or cured, and also this new emphasis on a kind of like empirical classificatory system that we can know mental illness, we can categorize it correctly, we can know what it is, and we can know what its outcome is going to be eventually. These are all the components of the modern psychiatric myth. The problem is that every part of the story is wrong, and it's not exactly true. So, like a big part of the myth, actually, that I didn't mention is that it relies on this backstory of horror and degradation. So they talk quite a bit about like the madhouse system that they're replacing. The way they talk about it is these like massive congregate facilities that are more or less like big dungeons, prisons where people are mistreated and beaten and starved, and they're treated like animals and they're thought about as animals. And there is some truth in some of this. The madhouse system was real. It was especially big in the major cities in Europe, in Paris and in London. But the spread is definitely overstated. And if you want to find a quality that characterizes the treatment of the mad prior to the psychiatric revolution, I would use the word eclectic. There's no one overriding means or method. It really depends on the local conditions in a way much more so than after the psychiatric revolution. So they're kind of already wrong in terms of their back history because they like to overstate the barbarity and the spread of these institutions, specifically because it serves as like a good grounds for revolution. If you're, replacing something that's massive, widespread, and horrible, it is like a gesture that allows you to like separate yourself and tell the world about what's new about you. So it's this severing gesture. And then in terms of like what they actually do, it's also very much overstated, and it's kind of like incorrectly told too. There's an author, Dora Wiener, who writes about the Pinel myth and the history of the like propagation of these myths, I think better than anyone else, who writes about how Pinel was very, very likely not the one who broke the chains at all. It was most likely Poussin, the superintendent, and and also the story is always that it happened at the Salpêtrière, but it did not. It happened at the men's asylum, the Bicêtre, in Paris, and it happened like in a different year than is often referred to. All the timings and all the like place names are all mixed up, and there's probably symbolic reasons why some of these things got mixed up. There's this famous painting that I kind of talk about in good detail in the book of Pinel taking the chains off of a number of women at the Salpêtrière. I think the narrative of like this paternal, all-caring father figure helping the distressed mad come to their senses and become human again was more powerful when it was a bunch of weak-seeming hysteric women and not madmen. So there's all these elements that have been tweaked and changed in order to increase the intensity or the symbolic power of this story, kind of despite the facts. And then, of course, the future element is like, if you just follow the like path of Pinel, will just like keep moving forward in this linear motion and, achieve greater and greater heights of enlightenment and compassion. I think what you end up actually seeing in psychiatry is this very cyclical movement of this repeated recognition that they failed in their mission, that these palaces of the mad that are supposed to be these palaces of health and care end up being exposed as not too dissimilar from the madhouses that they supposedly replaced, of being sites of congregation and separation and abuse. And then this myth has served as a kind of rejuvenating symbol that appears time and time again whenever psychiatry is at its lowest. It kind of looks back to this moment or to these types of figures as a way to symbol a new break, a new attempt to break with this cycle of violence and failure and try something new again. And so a good part of the book is about tracing those cycles of failure and why psychiatrists seem to be unable to escape from this cycle. There's a lot of mystification in the field of psychiatry. It's been commented many, many times that, of all the fields of health, psychiatry is somewhat unique in having an organized opposition on the one hand of what is often called anti-psychiatry, and also maybe a higher degree of like conspiracy theories around it. And there definitely are some conspiracy theories around psychiatry and big pharma and what they're up to, of terms being thrown around like brainwashing and psychic control and stuff like that, to various symbolic degrees. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes what exactly people mean by those terms. But one of the things I argue in the book is I think that if you want to look to the cause of these strange and somewhat magical forms of reasoning about what psychiatry does, you should look no further than psychiatry itself, because it engages in this kind of mystical, magical thinking constantly. And part of what I really wanted to do was to break with that magic thinking, which I think means looking not only at the psychiatric theories of mental illness and diagnostics and this patient psychiatrist encounter, but embedding the psychiatrist as a person, as an agent in a totality of social relationships that are determined not just by psychiatric knowledge and theory and the history of practice, but by political economic conditions, by historical conditions that make one specific place quite different from another, and like institutional norms and habits and conditions that go beyond just psychiatric theory. So all of that stuff, I feel like, is the part of the very process of breaking these myths and refusing to engage with these myths anymore and seeing how things really are. It means like actually looking away from psychiatry and looking at the world that it lives in, and then coming back to it and seeing how it engages.
Yeah, and I think you really do achieve that goal of demystifying and busting some of these very stubborn foundational myths of psychiatry. And in this book, you don't just reserve your critique for psychiatry. I see it as not just a critical history of psychiatry, but also of its discontent. So you really are working on both sides of this psychiatry, anti-psychiatry binary, and you refer to anti-psychiatry as this doppelganger of psychiatry, which I thought was so well put. So I'd love it if you could talk a little bit more about your research into anti-psychiatry and some of your main critiques of this movement and things perhaps that you admire in it as well.
Whenever this question comes up, you have to like first acknowledge that it's just like this ridiculously loaded conversation and question and word that can mean almost anything that people want it to mean. I mean, it's like one of those signifiers that just changes depending on who the person writing hates and wants to make fun of or dismiss. And, depending on your angle, the position of psychiatry or anti-psychiatry is either the good one or the stupid one that needs to be dismissed. So that in itself is kind of funny to me that both of them operate in this like supposed debate as dismissive terms. But more concretely, I think historically what people are usually referring to with anti-psychiatry in the vast majority of cases is a movement from like the 1960s through, depending on when you want to date it, you could say it goes through the present. You could say it ended like in the 90s with the rise of like more consumer oriented groups and embeddedness with groups like NAMI. It all depends on how you want to like date that specific social milieu, but there was a specific like fairly small but not negligible social milieu, especially on the East Coast in New York and Massachusetts, and the West Coast in Berkeley and other places in California, and then scattered around the country, some like kind of smaller places like Minot, North Dakota, and definitely a large contingent in Canada and in the UK as well, of people who usually like it was oriented around opposition to forced treatment. This is like one of the most common ones. They were usually in favor of like stronger legal rights for people who would generally be the object of psychiatry. And I use that kind of tortured phrase because there's a complete disagreement about who exactly the anti-psychiatry movement is talking about. Like some people willingly embrace the concept of madness and say like we're mad people organized against psychiatry, while other people go in this direction of like madness doesn't exist and psychiatry invents its object in order to repress it or socially control it or something like that. There's not actually in this supposedly organized movement, there's no agreement about who is even the subject of it, which is another kind of interesting detail. If you're not talking about the 1960s, I think one thing that's really interesting to discover about the critique of psychiatry or the organization of former and current patients against the field or critical of the field is that it actually goes back really far into the 18th century, even with opposition to the madhouse system from the people who were incarcerated inside. And then after the rise of like modern or what we would think of as psychiatry after Pinel in the 19th century, there were groups in the United States and England. There were anti-psychiatric groups or groups that were like critical of psychiatric institutions and laws in Germany, throughout Europe. So a lot of like what you want to think of as like the discrete anti-psychiatry movement depends on how you want to date these things and who you think should be included or not, or and so on. I don't particularly care too much about those historical debates, and I feel like in the book I do a great deal of violence to like the typical way that this is thought about, and I have a feeling that the way I characterize it will be like a thorn in a lot of people's side, but that was a little bit intentional because I really did not want to engage in this like binary critique that is often played out. I just feel like it's become somewhat theatrical, where there's like a position and then there's like the loyal opposition position, and it just kind of goes back and forth, and it feels somewhat predictable, and it feels somewhat, I feel like it's hit a wall. I don't really sense there's much exciting movement so much as like a pile of resentments that are going back and forth when these terms are thrown around. So I wanted to do something of great violence to it and like see what I could discover by characterizing it in a way that I think both sides would be unhappy with, which is that I argue that because psychiatry has always required in its founding mythos and its form of organization a past tense to break with. It always requires this construction of like the madhouse people were doing these things in this horrible way, and their institutional conditions led to abuse. And we're going to completely destroy that system, and we're going to end it, and we're going to bring in the reign of mercy and the reign of like true feeling. I end up arguing that this negative gesture is central to what psychiatry is and how psychiatry has permeated itself through society or through the social world. And so in a sense, every like founding gesture of psychiatry is also an anti-psychiatric gesture, that psychiatry in a sense requires anti-psychiatry so that it doesn't get stilted and stuck and frozen in place. It needs this negative gesture to break it up, to disassociate or to remove it from its sites that it's been stuck at and allow it to flow more freely into other spaces. And that brings me into the critique of like the discrete anti-psychiatry movement. So when I'm critiquing anti-psychiatry, I'm critiquing it from its own premises and its own projection of itself, its own like subjective position and what it claims to be doing. So it was really important to me also, in the same way that I wanted to go back and read these original psychiatrists and engage with them on their own level, it was really important to me to also not create another anti-psychiatry that's just yet another like projection of my own fantasies and projection of my own feelings about psychiatry and anti-psychiatry, which I think happens all the time with these two terms. It's just, you just see the personal anger and fear and confusion of the author play roles as if like a puppet show, and they end up just playing out on this stage, which feels very like predictable. So it was really important to me not to do that. So this part of the book required me to engage really deeply in these movements and read through all their journals. So I read through like, I went and found like original copies of like the Mental Patients Liberation Front journals. I read through tons of transcripts of Judy Chamberlain, and even like really boring administrative like work that didn't necessarily end up as footnotes in the book, but that informed like my knowledge of them. So I read through like a lot of these phone transcripts between different anti-psychiatry groups in the 60s and 70s. And I read about the kind of crisis houses they attempted to open and how things panned out for them. It involved like immersing myself in it. And if I had to like pick out elements of critique that I lay out in the book, one of them is the idea that anti-psychiatric thinking or work somehow contributed to the period that we refer to as deinstitutionalization, but which I prefer to refer to as decentralization. That there was somehow some direct agency that like anti-psychiatric figures or groups or thinking had on that process, I think is wrong. I don't really see any strong evidence for that. I think I see a correlation between a kind of thinking and a social process that happened. But in my mind, the real process was elsewhere. But that's a good example of this kind of like the way that people get very attached to their critique of one or the other side, and they imagine that they're so much more involved in things than they maybe even are. So that's another way that this binary itself feeds this mystification machine and this constant auto production of more and more myths. So doing this process of immanent critique was supposed to be a way to like get straight through to the actual work that people did on the ground and what effect it actually had, and engaging with them at the level of their own ideas and what they actually say about stuff. And on that level, I think there are some things that we can actually critique them for that they actually were involved in, and not things that they weren't actually involved in. But some of those are like there's a more common critique that you might hear even from someone like Alan Francis of what is called like the psychiatrization of everyday life, the increasing bounds of what is considered to be abnormal into increasingly microscopic differences. This is something that's been critiqued by tons of critics on the right and the left, and even, like I mentioned, some psychiatrists themselves. I do think that some of the things that the anti-psychiatric groups from the 60s and 70s were arguing for was also leaning towards that direction, and maybe even had an actual effect on the process of like psychiatrizing daily life. You see people like Claude Steiner, who was involved in the Radical Therapist Collective and later the Rough Times Collective, and helped to run this like free clinic out of Berkeley called the RAP Center. And it's really central to some of their arguments was like, madness is not a specific condition. It's something that's shared. It's part of a broader pathology of that is shared by like everyone who lives in. Oftentimes it would be like in capitalist society, but in some of the times it would just be like as part of the human condition. So we're going from like madness or mental illness as a condition that concerns a relatively small percentage of the population in a really intense way, to people on the left arguing that mental illness is a concern that involves absolutely everyone, and not concerns in the sense that like this is a social problem we need to work with or work through, but like everyone is in some sense mad or is in some sense like mentally ill. And there are like consequences to that are, I think people would now decry, like the aforementioned increasing like pathologization of small differences, even if that wasn't necessarily the intent. But I do think that there's a connection between these like alternative therapeutic models that later on became like established clinics and established like community mental health clinics that I think were really at the forefront of this, like, we're going to treat the neuroses of everyday life kind of approach to things. And then, yeah, there's kind of like a legal critique that I get into, and a critique of their like actual social organization, the way they organize themselves into groups. I do have a critique of, like, I feel like they were much too convinced of their uniqueness, maybe is a way to put it. Like, the anti-psychiatric groups wanted to insist on the one hand that madness was this very permeable, flexible, changeable concept, but then also had very strict criteria for who could be involved in the group and involved in their practical social activity based on their proximate relationship to the psychiatric field or psychiatric incarceration. And I don't necessarily have a solution to that question, but I think it's a contradiction. And I think it's one that ultimately ended up, for better or for worse, making the movement extremely small, because in order to fit those true criteria involves like it requires people to have gone through a very specific process that is like not a common one. So those are some of the critiques that I had.
I'm wondering if we can get a little bit more into some of that legal activism that you touched on. You write about the limits of what you call judicial activism to fight, for example, forced psychiatric interventions and other forms of harm. Specifically, you write, quote, positioning the law as a shield against force conceals the way in which the law acts as force and is grounded in it. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the ideas that you were trying to convey here around the limits of judicial activism and how we see them playing out in our current landscape, where these policies of forced psychiatric intervention and the erosion of hard-won civil rights appear to be eroding.
What I try to do in the book, and what I try to do with these kinds of questions, is balance the contradictions, or hold the contradictions together in some way. Because on the one hand, I think it's kind of irrefutable that giving a group of people who are facing widespread like institutional abuse, increasing judicial recourse to take some type of remedial action is a good thing. And it's an option that they didn't have before, that they then were able to have. That in itself is not like under critique necessarily. However, I think that some of the extreme focus on the law and the law, this imaginary that imagines the law as a potential shield, as I said, is faulty and can lead to some very precarious situations. And I think that it's kind of brought us to the precarious situation that we're in today to some extent. There's a point in the book where I quote Kate Millett, who says that in the psychiatric encounter, the law is prostituted before like psychiatry or something like that, where her point is basically that the law is like this firm thing. You break it and you're punished, and the action between those two things is relatively mechanical. So you understand the law, you know there's this distinction between what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And when you do the thing you're not allowed to do, you face the consequences, and it's all very kind of clear cut. And when you introduce psychiatry into the question, you introduce all these layers of discretion, like the psychiatrist has to kind of make the determination, a subjective determination of whether or not you're competent to withstand trial, or whether or not you were competent at the time of completing the crime or something like that. I think what is wrong ultimately with this form of critique is not its depiction of psychiatry necessarily, but its depiction of the law as if the law is this firm, clear object that acts mechanically in each situation. I cite the statistic in the book. I don't remember the exact number now, but the vast majority of cases, like over 90% in the United States, are dealt with not through finishing a trial, like, which would be like the normal legal process. I commit a crime, I go to trial, I have the ability to argue my case, the jury hears it. There's all these like protections in place to make sure that I'm getting the fairest trial possible, supposedly. The vast, vast majority in the United States are dealt with through plea bargains, which are these, very loose, very like discretionary decisions made where it's more of a deal made between the different parties that is not a direct response to the crime in question or the trial in question. So there's no long trial, deliberative trial happening. There's a fearful person who takes a plea bargain because they imagine they're not going to have quite as bad of a punishment if they just take it now. And also they don't want to wait. I mean, like, being on trial takes a lot of time, and it's extremely disruptive to your life, especially if it's not in the city that you live in. So these kinds of broader social conditions actually make it so the vast majority of trials and cases in courts are in no way this perfect picture of these like mechanical right and wrong kind of situations. And then the trial process itself is extremely discretionary. You're trying to convince a group of people of your side of the story, and you hope that it goes your way. But we know in America it very often does not, and many, many people are rotting in prison and didn't even do the thing that they were accused of. I also kind of lay into the idea of rights a little bit in the book, as if a right is like an actual protective thing that you can actually have as a property. That's not exactly how rights work. A right is frequently invoked as a remedial action because you were already harmed. So you don't need to invoke the right unless, like, you presume you're about to be harmed or the harm has already happened. So in that sense, in the sense that you're always invoking it in the past tense, does the right protect you from the abuse in the first place? No, it doesn't. You hope that it changes something in the system in the future so that the next person, or you in the next case, don't face the same type of abuse or the same type of harm. But it doesn't have this future capacity that people often act like it does. A right has to be invoked in a context and in a condition where it can be heard by a party who can actually do something about it. So it does not just protect in this absolute sense. And we need to get away from thinking about these concepts. Again, I'm kind of bringing it back to the mystification thing. We've created a mystification around rights as if they are like a property that we own. It's not a property. It's a process that we engage in when these incidences of harm and abuse come up. And we hope it goes our way, but it very often doesn't.
Yeah, I really love how you kind of take this push-pull of the law and rights and place it in this, social, economic, political context, and rightly so. And this brings me to one of our last questions. In the book, you write about the International Network of Alternatives to Psychiatry. And you also have recently co-founded a North American chapter. So I'd love if you could sort of talk to us a little bit about this organization historically and what makes it significant, and what is it that inspired or motivated you to get a North American network going?
The network is a group that formed in 1974 at an international conference that included a lot of people who were engaged in radical psychiatric, anti-psychiatric practices. The point of the network was really to establish like strategic relations between people engaged in doing like radical work around or in the field of mental health, and to kind of refuse this siloing that often happens where people only study the history of psychiatry in their own country or only engage in movements in their own country. So it was an internationalist push. It was also a push to critically examine the ways that this radical work in psychiatry was related to other social struggles. So, like, central to their thinking was that the MAD are engaged in some way with like struggles of the working class and these movements for like gay power and black power. So this all is like a part of of their thinking. The group didn't last like super long. It's hard to tell when exactly it kind of fizzled out. Maybe after the a few of the main members died, and then a few of the others kind of seemingly got involved in some other work. I think we're still all kind of reckoning with, like, in the mid 20th century, the rallying point for like this negative activity was the asylum. And now psychiatric services are much more decentralized. The asylum still exists, but it's not as centralized as it used to be. It used to be that was the central node around which everything was organized. And then it started to break up and shift. And interestingly, the network was actually established in response to that shift. In France, it's called sectorization, and in the US, they called it community psychiatry, of the way that psychiatry and psychiatric power was kind of like increasing its tentacles into various different regions and untapped reservoirs of human suffering. They like organized themselves actually in response to that, and in a way they wanted to organize this body of people who were thinking explicitly about it in order not to kind of lose track of what was going on, so they could have they could continue to have a kind of like global understanding of what was happening in the field. But I also think that the conditions itself made it hard for them to keep that work up, because the work was so like divergent. The things that people were engaged in were much more divergent than they had been in the past. And the sites of struggle were more spread out. And we face the same problem today, I think, even maybe more intensely. So the purpose of us establishing this chapter, and at the beginning, it was me and my friend Mel Butler, who's based in Los Angeles, was to try to respond to this challenge once again. The challenge both of not being siloed in a national context. So internationalism is, again, a major part of why we decided to do this, was to create a kind of internationalist organization or collection of networks, and also to respond to the increasing or just the continued diffusion of psychiatric power into so many different spheres, and even into like common language. So we have a much more like broad and diffuse thing that we feel the need to understand, to trace its paths and really figure out what that means practically. For now, we're focusing on the internationalist bent, and we're working to find people who are interested in doing translations from non-English contexts into English. And we have some people working on Spanish and Portuguese translations right now, and we have a promising lead in Italian. So like in a very immediate sense, the idea is to give English speaking audiences access to the fact that there are these like oftentimes larger and oftentimes more directly effective radical movements in the world of psychiatry that are not based in the United States and in the UK. So, I mean, we want people to engage with that stuff. We want people to know what it is and how you can find it, and what it's about. So that's a big part of what we're doing now. But the broader goal is to create just a real tangible network with people who are doing this stuff. So we have like our personal network. Like, this is just like a way to like send a signal out to people and like hope that people respond and are interested. Anybody who's really involved or interested in this, in thinking critically and about the field of psychiatry and the field of mental health is kind of invited to be a part of this. And also to establish like an actual tangible network list that we can reach out to in cases where, seeking solidarity for this or that, or seeking some insight into this or that, like who's done this work. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time, and we can increase our kind of strategic thinking with one another. So on the site, there is like a form that people can fill out with the name of their project, what they do, where they're based, like information like that. And if you do want to be part of this kind of list, it's intended to be more or less a public resource. So keep that in mind. But we're just trying to recreate some network affiliations, and hopefully in the future host some collective events and have like in-person meetings where we can talk about what is the struggle around these topics been like in your country, and what can we learn from each other in a really basic sense.
The very much needed and exciting project, and we'll absolutely be sure to link to that form in the transcript so folks can submit their projects. And so lastly, Sasha, I'm hoping you can tell folks a little bit more beyond the North American network of alternatives to psychiatry. How can they follow your work and keep up with what it is that you're up to?
Yes, I still update my Substack blog of Unsound Mind. Admittedly, right now it's at a bit of a slow point because of all the book stuff I'm doing, but in the future there will be more works going on there. I'm working on like a very long-term project about what was madness before psychiatry and how was it treated. So that's a place to check out. I recently started a chapter of the ISPS US in Minnesota, the International Society for Social and Psychological Approaches to Psychosis. So if you're interested in that group or if you're a member of that group and want to connect, definitely reach out. That's probably the best way people to follow.
Well, I just know that I'm sitting in a lot of gratitude for your work, as well as the many lineages of struggle and liberation that you're drawing upon in this work. And I just wish you all the best of luck with this and all of your continued endeavors. And thank you so much again for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much, Leah. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.